Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks to everyone who made the trek in, and hi to everybody who's online. So, just to give you a sense of what I'm going to talk to you about today. So, I'm thinking that I'm going to give you an overview of sort of how my book fits in the landscapes of similar books. Then I'll kind of delve into the chapters that really have the most to do with my own research. So I'll be talking quite a bit about my own research findings. And then I'll zoom out towards the end and just tell you about some of the other chapters and some of the other research that I talk about in the book as well. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions, I think. So I think it's safe to assume that probably everyone in here and everyone online has heard of this book, right? How to Win Friends and Influence People. If you haven't read it, it's probably been referenced. It's referenced regularly in pop culture. This book was written back in 1936, and I'm going to show you its Amazon ranking today. I literally looked this up like 2 hours before I came down here. It is still, after being written in 1936, number 54 in Amazon's best-selling books. And as someone who has never even gotten close to breaking the top 100, that is just an extraordinary feat to do it once, but to do it that many years after publication. And it's not just this book, right? Probably many of you have seen lots of books on influence. So here's a few more you may have seen, recent and older books, some from the 80s, some from just this last year. And all these books tend to be incredibly popular. Seminars on how to gain influence tend to be incredibly popular and well attended. And one of the things that I find so interesting about that is that it seems like people just really have this need to understand how to influence other people, right? Like we feel perpetually like we don't have the skills, like we need to figure out how to win friends and influence people. And as much as that message sort of resonates with me as well, you're like, how am I doing? How could I do better? It also is in pretty stark contrast to my own research and research I see in social psychology. So I'm a social psychologist who studies social influence. And really, as social psychologists, we see all the time how much we are influenced by other people. So just performing with other people in the room changes the way that we perform and think about our performance. When we walk into a room and we don't know what to do, what's the first thing we do? We look at other people and we mimic what they're doing, right? And even just a throwaway remark by someone, we can think about, days or weeks or months and even years later, and it can continue to impact how we think about something, decisions we make. And so we are constantly influenced by other people, but that means that we are also constantly influencing other people as well. And so maybe instead of reflecting this actual need that people have for tools to gain influence, the popularity of these books really reflects a psychological bias that many of us seem to have, where we underestimate the influence that we have. And so my book was really written to address that, to go through a number of psychological biases where we seem to miss the times when other people are being influenced by us, sometimes in, major ways, sometimes in very subtle ways. And we just don't see that because maybe it happens, later, or it happens in their head where we don't have access, or maybe we expected it to look different. And so I'll talk about primarily the bias that I study, but I'll also talk a little bit about some of the other biases I talk about in the book at the very end. So first, I want to start with a study I also talk about in the book, or an experience I had in graduate school. And so when I was a graduate student at Columbia University, that other school in New York, I was in New York City, and I was working with a professor, Frank Flynn, who is then a professor at Columbia. And we were working on a study looking at kind of just traditional influence. And one of the things I had to do to run the study was to take the subway down to New York Penn Station because we wanted an adult representative sample, and to just go up to random people with my little survey and say, hey, will you please fill out my survey? And so each day for a number of days, I would go down, take the subway, go up to people, and it was just so painful. it was just the worst. And if anyone, can resonate, I'm sure most of you can, going up to strangers and asking them for things is just the worst, right? It was traumatic. And so I go into Penn Station and I have this like visceral reaction. So the study finished eventually and I could stop doing that. And I took, all the data and entered it, and Frank and I went through it. And it turns out the study didn't work. This is pretty typical in experiments, right? Lots of our studies don't work. But I had put so much effort into this and it had just felt so painful that I was like, I just can't believe it. After all that I went through, the study didn't work. And Frank looked at the data. And one of the things I had kept track of was how many people had said yes to me when I made these requests. And he said, I hear you describing this awful experience that was just terrible, and you worried about people rejecting you, and you worried about the things these New Yorkers were going to say to you. But I'm looking at the data, and actually, most people said yes to you. And you also recorded what people said, and most people were really polite to you when they said no. And so, actually, looking at this sort of objective, hard data, I realized that my own experience in my head was so different from reality. The way I thought things were going, these interactions were kind of going, actually, they were going much more positive, and I was much more pessimistic about what was happening. And so Frank and I thought that that itself, this idea that influence and even how much, the other person likes you, which we'll get to at the very end, but mostly that influence may feel very different in our heads than it actually is in reality. And we thought this could be a finding that we could follow up on in our own research. And so we decided to bring participants into the lab, since we were experimental social psychologists, and basically put them in the exact same situation that I had been in Penn Station. So we brought participants into the lab and we said, for our very first study, you're going to do what I did at Penn Station. We said, we're going to give you a stack of questionnaires. You're each going to get 5 blank questionnaires to get filled out. And you're going to go out onto campus and ask strangers to fill out these questionnaires. Before they did that, so we gave them a script that's where we said, here's how you're going to ask. Here's the request you're going to make. You're going to say, will you fill out a questionnaire? You're not going to add anything. You're not going to ask in any particular way, just a very simple script. And before they went out to make these requests, we asked them, how many people do you think you're going to have to ask before 5 people will agree to this request, before you get enough people to do this so that you complete your task? So this is what people said. We said, how many people will you need to ask to get 5 people to agree? Our participants, before they went out, predicted they would have to ask about 20 people before 5 people would agree. Then they actually went out and made these requests, kept track of everybody that they asked, and came back and brought the data to us. And when we looked at the data of the actual number of people that they had to ask, we found that they actually had to ask around 10. So about half as many people as they had anticipated. This means that they were rejected about half as often as they had expected. So you may say, maybe people just really love filling out surveys because you just keep talking about asking people for surveys. And so we wanted to make sure that this effect replicated to other kinds of requests. So I'm going to show you a different kind of graph showing the same data right now. So that left gray bar is our participants' predictions. They thought they would have to ask 20 people before 5 people would agree. The pink bar is what they actually did. They only actually had to ask about 10 people before 5 would agree. And we decided to replicate this with a number of different other kinds of requests. So in our next study, we told our participants, you're going to go out and ask strangers to borrow their cell phones. So same thing, come into the lab. Here's your task. You're going to go out and ask people, hey, I'm participating in an experiment. I need to call the experimenter. Can I just borrow your phone to make a call? Before they did that, they guessed how many people they would have to ask. In this case, they had to get 3 people to agree, and they had to call us back at the lab with 3 different people's phones. What we found is that once again, they thought that they were going to have to ask more people than they actually had to ask to get 3 people to loan them their phones. So by almost twice as much, they expected to be rejected, essentially. In another study, we took advantage of the fact that Columbia has a gym on campus that is kind of hard to find, so it's kind of underground. And we brought them down to the south side of campus, And we told our participants, you're going to ask someone to walk you basically 3 city blocks up to the north end of campus to find the gym. And you're going to say, hey, I can't find the gym. Can you just take me there? And if the person tried to describe where it was, they would say, I was up there. Will you just walk me there? And in this case, they only had to get one person to do it because it was quite a big ask at the time, 3 blocks. And so in this case, they thought they were going to have to ask about 7 people before a single person agreed to walk them to the gym. In fact, they only had to ask about 2. In another study that we actually did here at Cornell, some graduate students and I decided we wanted to just come up with, the most random thing we could come up with, something that was almost inexplicable. And we said, let's just have them ask people to count a jar of beans. And so we filled up these jars of pinto beans with hundreds of beans in them. And people knocked on the dorm rooms of people that they didn't know, had to be people they didn't know, and said, hey, as part of a project, I have to get an accurate count of these beans. Will you just do a second count for me? In this case, they had to get 2 people to agree. They thought they would have to ask about 9 people. They actually had to ask closer to 4. And now I have many, many jars of pinto beans in the lab taking up shelf space. And then in a last study that I'm going to show you, you may be thinking, these are all really contrived experiments. You're making people ask for things that they wouldn't ordinarily ask for. So maybe that's part of what's going on. And so we wanted to make sure that we were able to show this effect with people who were already planning to ask for something and were asking for something that they cared about and something big enough that it seemed sort of substantial. And so what we did is we teamed up with Team in Training, which is part of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And what you do for Team in Training is you raise money to participate in a race like a marathon or triathlon. And to do that, you ask people to sponsor you for this race. So people are putting in money to sponsor you. And your goal is usually in the thousands of dollars. So it ranges from like $2,000 to $7,000 in this particular sample. And so we had 100 people who were already committed to participating in Team in Training complete a survey before they went out and started making requests. And we said, how many people do you think you're going to have to ask before you reach your fundraising goal of X amount of dollars? Then they kept track of this, and Team in Training was really good. They had this log where they asked everybody to keep track so that they knew how fundraising was going. And so they kept careful track of everybody they asked. And in this study as well, and these numbers are times 10 because they were asking many more people. They thought that they would have to ask over 200 people to reach their fundraising goals. They actually had to ask closer to 100. And when you think about that, how hard it is to ask for things, asking 100 fewer people than you expect is a really, really big deal. I'll also say that this effect was apparent even without all this data. So participants would come into the lab, we would tell them, hey, you're going to go out onto campus and ask strangers for things. And there was a palpable tension. They really did not want to do this. They were so nervous about it. They would ask questions like, what if nobody agrees? What if it takes longer than the time that we have? What do we do? And then they would go out and do it. And they would come back and they would practically bound back into the lab. They were so just amazed at how much easier this was than they had expected. So it was visible even just eyeballing their reactions. The thing is that when they would bound back into the lab, they would say things like, people are so much nicer than I thought. People are really friendly. People are so warm and generous. And to some extent, that's true. And there's research showing that, in fact, people are more pro-social and charitable and warm than we tend to think. But we actually were really interested in another thing that was going on. And that's this. If you imagine this interaction from the other side, someone comes up to you and says, hey, I really need to use your phone. How awkward is it to say no to that person, right? Someone's standing there asking for your help. It's really hard to say no. It's embarrassing. It's uncomfortable. It could insinuate that there's something about the other person you don't trust. And we really don't like the idea of sort of breaking social bonds and suggesting we don't trust someone and making them feel like we don't like them. And so we're really put in a super awkward spot when we're on the receiving end of being asked for something. But when we're the ones doing the asking, we tend to forget that. And so if this is at least part of what's going on in these studies, that means that we should find similar effects in other kinds of domains that maybe aren't so pro-social or these kind of innocuous favors that we initially started with having people ask for. And so we got into the darker side of this effect. We started by having our participants once again come into the lab, and we told them, okay, you're going to go out onto campus just like before, and you're going to ask people to tell a white lie. You're going to go up to people and say, I'm supposed to be giving a pitch about a new course that's being offered on campus. I really don't feel like doing it. I need to get signatures saying I did it. Will you just sign this thing saying that I gave you this pitch I didn't give you? Right? So essentially signing a form, lying. And we asked our participants the same questions. If you're going to go out and do this, right, how many people do you think you would have to ask before a certain number agree? In this case, I believe it was 3. And then they went out and actually did this and kept track of how many people they actually had to ask. So same kind of paradigm. So here I'm showing you the same data I already showed you, just squished to the left, right? That's the kind of pattern we found when people ask for favors and help requests. When we had them ask for an unethical request, we found the same kind of thing. So people thought that they would have to ask a little over 8 people. They actually had to ask a little over 4 people to get 3 people to tell a lie for them. And you may be thinking, you know, that seems really like a no harm, no foul kind of situation, right? Telling a lie, signing a form. You could even convince yourself that you were doing someone a favor, that it was pro-social. So, you know, is this really unethical, or are people interpreting this as just another favor request? And so we wanted to replicate this finding with an actual unethical request that was really, really, really hard, nearly impossible to kind of justify and say that it was actually just a pro-social request. And so we did this appropriately, since we're standing here in a library, by having participants ask strangers to vandalize library books. So our participants were told, you're going to go into libraries, you're going to go up to people and say, hey, I'm playing a prank on a friend, but they know my handwriting. Would you just write the word pickle and pen in this library book? And we took a bunch of books off of my shelf. No actual library books were harmed. I feel like it's especially important to say that here. We took a bunch of books off my shelf and put the library codes on them so they looked like library books at our institution. We've done this at Cornell, and we also did this at my other university in Waterloo. And we gave them to participants with a pen. And once again, they predicted how many people they thought would agree. And then they actually went into libraries and asked people to vandalize these purported library books. And again, the reason we had them do this was because we really didn't want the sort of argument to be that, well, people are just doing something pro-social. This is clearly just them interpreting this as doing someone a favor. And so we wanted to double check that that's not how people were interpreting things. And so we asked our participants to record what people said when they made this request. And the kinds of things people said were things like this. I'm not sure if I should. It's a library book. On a library book, whoa. Only if I won't get into trouble. I hope you don't get into shit for this. So clearly people were encoding this as vandalism. Some of them actually used the word vandalism. They were encoding this as an unethical request, and they felt uncomfortable doing it. And so when we looked at the data, interestingly, we found the same pattern of results. In this case, they had to get 3 people to vandalize the library book. They thought they would have to ask almost 11. They actually had to ask closer to 5. So even though people felt clearly uncomfortable doing this thing and vandalizing this library book, they felt even more uncomfortable saying no to the person who was asking. And so this leads us into another domain, and that is the domain of romantic advances. And so we saw in a lot of Me Too cases over the past number of years, situations that were less sort of heinous and monstrous and more that seemed like misunderstandings. And in some ways, those became the most viral cases because people were arguing over what was really going on. Right? Are these indicative of broader issues around dating relationships and romantic relationships? Are these true examples of Me Too? Are they actually diluting the movement? And so one of the particularly contested cases that came out in this discussion was the case of Aziz Ansari. So Aziz Ansari went on a date with a woman, and after this date, she wound up feeling like she had been pressured into sleeping with him and felt uncomfortable and like he wasn't reading her cues. And she wound up texting him, but she also wound up talking to a website called Babe, which no longer exists, but they wound up publishing an article that was widely shared and wound up going viral. And so in this article, which was titled, I Went on a Date with Aziz Ansari, It Turned into the Worst Night of My Life, which kind of gives you a preview of what she talked about. She used the pseudonym Grace, not her real name, and she said that she used verbal and nonverbal cues to indicate how uncomfortable and distressed she was. So here she is. She feels like it was really uncomfortable and I did my best to say no in the moment. And Aziz Ansari, once he was contacted by her and once this became a public thing, he wound up issuing a statement and also talking to her and saying he was surprised and concerned, believing his encounter with this woman to be, by all indications, completely consensual. And when you kind of look at these two sides of the story, it looks a lot like the dynamics we've been talking about. You've got one person asking for something, potentially pushing for something, and another person feeling like it's really hard to say no, but the person asking is not realizing that. And so we wondered if this would play out experimentally as well. And so we sent people out to sexually harass people. Just kidding. We didn't do that. That would have been bad. But we did run an experiment. And in this experiment, we had people imagine that they were either romantically interested in one of their coworkers, or they were randomly assigned to another condition where they imagined that one of their coworkers was romantically interested in them. In both conditions, the story went on to say that the person said no and was not interested. And then we asked both parties how comfortable they felt it was for the other person to say no, and to what extent they would feel awkward saying no, etc. I'll show you the exact items in a sec. So we called the people who made these advances suitors, for lack of a better word. And this is their ratings of how difficult they thought it would be for the other person to say no if they were to ask this person on a date, how bad the person would feel saying no, how uncomfortable the person would feel saying no, and how guilty the person would feel saying no. And these are suitors' responses. Targets' responses. So what we found is that targets said, even in this randomly assigned Vignette study, they said it would be harder to say no than the person asking assumes it would be. So we're seeing the same kind of perspective disconnect, suggesting that if you ask someone out, you don't realize sort of how hard it's going to be for that person to say no if they're not interested. Now, this was a Vignette study, so we wanted to make sure this also extended to real life contexts. And so we also ran a survey where we asked STEM graduate students if they had had this experience in the past. And we asked them if they had had an experience of either being basically hit on by someone in their lab or in their field who they weren't interested in, or whether they had pursued someone romantically who wound up not being interested in them and they found out after the fact. And we asked people, depending on the condition and what they were recalling, we asked them how difficult it was either for them to say no to these romantic advances, or how difficult you thought it was for that person who rejected you to go ahead and reject you. And so once again, we're looking at suitors. So suitors were pretty low on the scale. And then when we look at targets, targets are a little bit higher, saying it was more uncomfortable, it was harder, I felt worse saying no to this person than this person imagined I had felt. We also asked a number of behavioral consequences. So it's not just that it felt bad, but we also asked the suitors, for example, so you asked someone out and they weren't interested in you. What do you think happened after that? Did that person, avoid you? Did that person talk to someone else about the situation? Did that person waste energy thinking about the situation? And suitors, for the most part, thought that people didn't spend a lot of time doing that. But targets, in fact, said quite a bit that they did spend energy either avoiding the suitor, just wasting energy thinking about things, talking to people about the situation, and a number of more serious, although less common, outcomes like having their productivity suffer, and even to some extent considering switching labs and careers. So once again, we're seeing this sort of disconnect between people asking for something and the person being asked, and basically the influence that that person has over the other person, right? How hard it is for that person to say no to a direct request. So the takeaways so far are that people are more likely to agree to do things for us than we think. That this is in part because people find it harder to say no than we think, but it is also because people are more helpful than we realize. So both those things are happening. We have more influence than we think because of all this, and that can be good and bad, right? In situations where we're raising money or we're asking for pro-social things or we need a quick favor, this is a good thing, right? Asking someone, even if in the moment it's hard for them to say no, is often beneficial for both people. The person who helps ends up interpreting what they did as being, a good person. They feel good about themselves. They experience what people call the warm glow of helping. And so in many cases, it can actually be beneficial, although it can also, of course, be abused where, you keep asking people for favors and then they feel like they can't say no. But in many cases, it is a good thing. But of course, there's also the sort of dark side to this power that we essentially have just by asking for things. And that's that people really find it hard to say no to things, even things they would rather not do. And so the last thing I'm going to talk about related to this research is the fact that this is especially true when we're in positions of power. So far, the studies I've shown you have been, for the most part, between equal parties. So just random strangers asking one another, students asking other students. But there's many contexts where we're in a position of power over somebody else and we make a request. And as much as there's kind of this idea that when you're in a position of power, you're very aware of the power you have, a lot of research suggests that actually we may be even less aware of the power we have when we're in a position of power. We are worse at taking other people's perspectives and considering kind of the position we might be putting them in when we ask for something. We also ourselves feel less constrained and feel like we can say no and we can decide what we want to do. And we wind up overextending that to assume that everybody feels that way. So if we make a suggestion, for example, to an employee, we think if they're uncomfortable with it, they'll just push back. They'll just tell us, they don't want to do it. But in fact, as one of my colleagues, Adam Galinsky, says, when you're in a position of power, your whisper sounds like a shout to the people who are not in positions of power. So in fact, they often don't feel like they can push back, and that a minor suggestion is actually, in many ways, sort of interpreted as an order. And so I'll just tell you a little story and first give you my favorite quote on this particular issue. So my favorite quote from this, just because it's just so beautiful, is from The Devil Wears Prada. And this is Meryl Streep talking to Annie, who works for her, and basically telling Annie she needs to take the position of her friend and colleague and basically stab her in the back so that she can go on this Paris trip that her friend, whose name I can't remember actually right now, really, really wanted to go on, right? And so she says, if you don't go, I'll assume you're not serious about your future at Runway or any other publication. The decision is yours, right? So there's this kind of presumption that this is your decision. This is on your plate. There's this autonomy that's kind of conferred in that sentence that is clearly not there in this moment, right? She's basically saying your career is going to be over. I'm your boss telling you to do this. The decision is yours. And I think that that general kind of way of saying things, hinting at things, and then assuming that, you still have freedom to make a choice is a misperception that a lot of people have in powerful positions. And so the example I talk about in the book, or one of the examples, which I think is sort of the most related to what we've been talking about and one of the most striking examples, is this example of a Rutgers coach who wound up running these free throw drills with his players, where he basically said, okay, we're going to change things up, and I'm going to have you take off an article of clothing for each free throw that you miss. And so he asked his players to play this game. By the end of it, a couple of the players who were particularly nervous free throwers wound up being completely naked and being asked to run wind sprints up and down the court as everybody watched. So it was clearly incredibly humiliating for them. And at the end, the players wound up leaving Rutgers and suing the coach for sexual harassment. And it's worth noting, both players went on to lead their next teams to NCAA tournament slots. So because this was a lawsuit and it was covered quite a bit in the media, you can see sort of how both parties are describing the experience, and you can see a lot of the same nuances we've been talking about. So here's Coach Bannon's way of talking about his decision to do this, right? He said it was a lighthearted contest. There's a lot in his quotes. A lot of it is just about, bringing levity to the team and how it was just like being silly and lighthearted. And he regularly insists when he talks about this incident that absolutely no one was forced to remove his clothes or to run. So there's this idea that I did not force you, right? It's very Miranda Priestley in A Devil Wears Prada, right? The decision was yours. You could have chosen not to do this. But as we see from the quotes from the players, in particular, the sort of main player involved, Josh Sankey's, he responded in one of these media outlets, optional, after he heard that Coach Bannon said, well, it was just an optional sort of game. Optional. How can he say it was optional? Who would do something like that if it was optional? Your coach tells you to do something. There's nothing optional about it, right? So again, it's very similar to the context we've been talking about. One person is asking someone to do something, in this case, someone with a lot of power over his players, and feeling like if you don't like it, you'll just say no. When in fact, the people being asked feel like there's absolutely no choice in the matter, right? That they don't actually have the option to say no. All right, so I'm just going to zoom out and talk a little bit about the other things I talk about in the book, and then I'm happy to talk in more details about any of the things that have come up, including these additional chapters. So what we've talked about so far, as I mentioned in the beginning, right, we have these biases that lead us to underestimate our influence, to think that we don't have as much influence as we actually have. And the one that we've gone into the most depth about so far is this idea that people will do things for us more than we expect. That we can basically just get people to do things through simple asks more so than we think. But there are also a number of other ways that we also underestimate our influence. And what I think is important about that is that each of these ways are also good and bad, right? They can also have good outcomes and bad outcomes, and they are also exacerbated by power. So one is that people tend to notice us more than we realize. So one of the researchers I talk about quite a bit in the book, Erica Boothby, who's a colleague of mine, has done studies on something she calls the invisibility cloak and invisibility cloak illusion. And so her studies show essentially that we often walk through the world feeling like nobody's noticing us or paying attention to us. And you can imagine, you're just sitting on the subway doing your thing, looking at your phone, maybe you have headphones on, maybe you have sunglasses and you're walking through the park, kind of feeling invisible, as if you're wrapped up in an invisibility cloak. And what she shows is that actually people notice us more often than we think and are curious about us more than we think. They wonder what we're thinking, what we're doing, why we're dressed that way, what we're on our way to. They are curious. We are curious about other people, and that means other people are curious about us. But there are a lot of social norms that prevent us from noticing when other people are noticing us. So one of them is something called gaze aversion. So if you've ever sort of sat, for example, on a subway and looked up and caught eyes with someone, you quickly look away, right? And everyone quickly looks away because that's kind of the polite, normal thing to do. And then Erica Boothby finds that when you ask people, did that person catch you looking at them, or did you just catch them looking at you? That we tend to think that we were the ones kind of peeking, looking at other people, when in fact, it's impossible, right? You would see kind of a 50-50 that sometimes it's you looking at someone, sometimes it's someone else looking at you. And so we tend to think that we're perceiving everybody else and curious about everybody else, but other people aren't as curious about us. And that can have a lot of implications, right? So as I mentioned in the very beginning, simply seeing what someone else is doing can tell us what the norms are. Someone either threw their trash on the ground or put it in the recycling. Now I know the norm for this space, and now I'm more likely to mimic that norm. And so when we do notice people, it actually has a big effect on our behavior and our thinking. And that means when people notice us, right, it has a big effect on their behavior and their thinking. Another bias that we have is we tend to think that people don't think about us and the things we say and kind of discount the things we say more than they actually do. So there's research, some of this research is also by Erica Boothby, showing that if you have an interaction with someone and then you walk away from that interaction, we underestimate how much that other person continues to think about the things that we say, right? So that person is still kind of thinking about the conversation, thinking about us. She also has work showing that they're thinking about us in a more positive light than we think. And so really, again, even if we're not seeing that we had this impact right there as we're talking to someone, we are having this delayed impact. We're still living on in people's heads in ways we often don't see. And there's also other research showing that we tend to think that other people are going to sort of discount the things we say and are kind of primed to argue with us, when in fact, in most cases, people just accept the things we say as true, because if they didn't, communication would be nearly impossible, right? If every time, you said that my steak is overcooked, or I read, this book last week, I said, I don't believe you, I don't believe you, we'd never be able to have conversations. And so most of the things we say, people wind up just taking as true. And so when we say these things, they go on to believe them, think about them, think more positively about them, and potentially spread them to other people. And once again, that can be good and bad, right? So if we say something positive and it makes its way around, that's great. But if we spread misinformation or, gossip about people that isn't warranted, that also makes its way around. And once again, these things are exacerbated by power. So we pay more attention to people in power. We follow their norms more. We also, again, the sort of quote about how a powerful person's whisper sounds like a shout, right? That rings in our heads more strongly and for longer than someone who has less power. And so the same sort of dynamics we saw with the research I showed you also play out in each of these domains. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with is my favorite metaphor from the book, which is that we all are a little bit like Mr. Magoo. And so for those of you who don't know who Mr. Magoo is, he is a cartoon character who started as early as the 40s, but I think he's more associated with like the 50s and on. And he was basically this nearsighted character who never wore his glasses. And because of that, he would walk through scenes and just disrupt everything in the scene and cause chaos, sometimes like major chaos where like rockets would shoot into space. But he was totally oblivious of this wake of chaos he would leave. And what I argue in the book is that in a lot of ways, we are like Mr. Magoo, because as we walk through the world, slightly oblivious to how much people are noticing us, listening to us, doing things for us, or copying what we do, we are kind of leaving our own wake through the world that we're not even aware of. And with that, I will end and take any questions from the room or from online. So you have to wait for the microphone.
Hi, Professor Bohns.
Hi.
Yeah. So in your study on help requests, right? So the people you asked were people on campus. So could it be just that people on Columbia is more friendly to help, like to help a fellow student out, so that they help more rather than because they're complying to the request?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's why the team and training study is so important, because that was not university students. Those were professional adults who were participating in team and training. So we know it at least generalizes to that context. And I'll also add that we've done a lot of university settings. But so it's not just Columbia, even though there have been more university sort of samples than sort of professional or adult samples. But yeah, so we've done it in Canada, and we've done it in China, and we've done it in California. And yeah, we keep finding the same effects. Got another question here.
Thank you. What was the most challenging part of the book, or which part of the book took you the longest to write?
That is a really great question. So the book is kind of divided up into two parts. The first half is very much a more traditional sort of self-helpy book where it's like, you have all this influence, isn't that great? And it's very feel good. And the second half of the book is much more, okay, now what does that mean? Like, what kind of responsibility comes with that? What kind of negative effects might come from that? And I would say the bridge between those was the hardest chapter to write. Like, how am I going to get people to sort of get the candy in the beginning and then still make it fun to read through to like the harder parts. But I think, I tried to still make the hard parts fun, but definitely that bridge, I thought a lot about that chapter 4. Yeah. Oh, we have another. Okay.
So Nancy asks, did you see any gender patterns regarding the influencer or the influenced?
Yeah, so that one really depends on, well, to some extent, actually, no. Across all of the studies, we don't see differences in the bias. So the underestimation of how likely you are to get a yes, essentially. But then we do get these gender differences, for example, in the romantic advances study, right? So not surprisingly, many more women reported having been in the position of target before. And so when you look at that, it looks like you have a gender effect in that study. But then once you control for people's personal experience, it actually goes away. So what we find is that women are more likely to have been in the position of target. But when they are in the position of suitor, right, when they are the ones asking, they still make this error.
Hi, so my question is more about like the influence that people saying yes or no has on the person who's asking. And do those have like different amounts of influence on that person if they have influence at all?
So, like, if I ask and I get a no, like, what does that mean to the person who just asked? That's a great question because, a major reason people don't ask is because they worry about rejection, because rejection is so painful. And, we're wired to affiliate with people and be social creatures. And so we take rejection very personally. And so we do have studies showing, for example, what happens when you do multiple requests. So we have one where we have people make a first request and they make a guess of how likely someone is to say yes. And then if they get a no or a yes, regardless, they make a guess about how likely that person would be to say yes or no to another request. And we find that initial rejection really sours people. Like they think that first rejection means that this person just isn't helpful. Maybe I shouldn't be asking for this thing. And so they attribute it to a lot more stable factors. When it's usually just circumstantial. It's usually just that person didn't have time or the skills to do something. And so I do think I actually talk about this a lot when we have to say no to someone or reject someone, that the way we do it and the attributions we make do impact that person, right? If you're really clear that the reason I'm saying no is because of time, I'd be happy to do it in the future. It's not about you. It's not about our relationship. All that stuff is important to convey because people will kind of interpret it negatively, and you can have an impact even when you're the rejecter. Yeah.
Online, a follow-up question from Dolores regarding gender. Can you say anything about the common perception that women have more difficulty asking for raises than men do?
Yeah, so the research on that has been going back and forth lately. So the sort of traditional and classic way of thinking about it and initial data was that women don't ask as much. And so that's part of the reason that people have attributed for the gender wage gap. And then later, some research has shown that even when women do ask at equal rates of men, they still get more no's when they're asking for things like raises. So it's like not for help per se. I think it's a different context is a big part of it. Like asking for help fits this communal kind of warm expectation of women, but asking for a raise is more sort of agentic and male seeming. And so it is a different kind of domain. Here's a helpful way I like to think about my findings and gender and race is that there's kind of 3 buckets. There's the actual influence you have. there's this bias I'm talking about where you misperceive your influence. And then there's what that means to you. So like we see in plenty of research that there are actual racial and gender differences in actual influence, right? That's a real thing that exists. In most of our studies, we don't see any difference in the bias, so that regardless of what the actual level is, we're still underestimating. We still are more pessimistic than we need to be across demographics. But then there's this last piece where what does that mean to you? So if I'm a woman and I'm conditioned to be liked and not rock the boat and be communal, and I think if I ask for something, I'm going to be rejected, which I could interpret as rocking the boat and not being liked, right? I may be less likely to ask. But if I'm a man and I'm not conditioned in the same way and I have that misperception, I think I might get rejected. I might just go for it because what's the harm? It's not as socially, I don't perceive it as socially risky for me. And so there's kind of the actual finding and then like what it means to different people.
Hi,
Hi.
thank you so much for speaking with us today. So this summer, I actually got the chance to read the book, and it was
Aw,
great. So
thanks.
thank you. But after reading it, there were a few things I was thinking about, and after hearing this presentation, I think some of it is about like what is like some of the implications of this research and how you could use it to kind of change what actually happens in the real world. And so I'm thinking like I'm in a mediation class right now, and I'm thinking about like how a big company could kind of set up its infrastructure to mitigate some of these situations. I'm sure a lot of them happen in a context that's a little bit more informal and can't necessarily have like a company provided mediator, which has its own problems in its own right. Um, but what can a company do to ensure that people without power and people in power realize that there's some inequities there?
Yeah, that's a very big but great question. um, I think so, a lot of the sort of reactions to, for example, the Me Too movement and different, unethical things that wind up coming to light are to try to rebalance the power structure, right? So one of the things I talk about in the book specifically with respect to Me Too, but I think kind of could be used as a parallel, right? Is that, people are like, why does someone who, had a consensual relationship with his subordinate have to be fired, right? Just because he, broke the rules or whatever. And those kinds of things that people think are some subsets of people think are real overreactions are attempts to right the balance, right? Try to equalize this balance structure that was already there, that subordinates, right, are always the ones who suffer more consequences traditionally because, they just don't have the same resources and connections, et cetera, that the higher level person has. And so some of these sort of extreme measures that appear extreme from the outside are done sort of to sort of right that imbalance. But I'd say, in general, there's kind of things that individual people in power can do. Like listening is a big thing I talk about in the book. So part of it is, when we find ourselves in positions of leadership, we often start out, I mean, everyone starts out not being in a position of leadership, right? We make our way up the chain. We work really hard to get there, improve ourselves, and then we wind up in this position of leadership, and we often feel like we still have to prove ourselves because that's our mode. We suddenly have to shift modes, and that's really hard to do. And so often we do things that are counterproductive, like jump in and talk a lot, or discount people's ideas because we want to show how smart we are. Right. And so part of it is reflecting and taking a step back and recognizing that you need to make space for other people who are not in powerful positions. So training leaders to take up less space by, not talking first, by responding to people's suggestions in ways that aren't maybe as critical as their go-to. And then, of course, there's, as with the Me Too sort of example, there's bigger structural issues and policies that probably would need to change. But yeah, it's a huge question, but a really good one. Yeah.
So we have another question. This is possibly a follow-up again to what you just answered, Vanessa. Henry asks, how, if at all, does your research apply to the workplace where there are pre-existing authority levels?
Yeah. So actually, and yeah, this may be related as well. So there's some interesting misperceptions as well in how formal power is related to influence. And so one interesting paper that I really like shows that people who are younger, which would also be people in more junior positions, think that people who are older, who would typically be people in more senior positions, are less interested in hearing their advice and ideas than they actually are. So when given the option to give advice to someone who's below you or above you, you assume the person below you is the one who would be more responsive to that advice. But in fact, it turns out that even people above are really interested in the advice of, junior people and people who are willing to sort of share their ideas. And so this idea that I sort of don't have influence, that my ideas are going to be discounted, also seems to be a bit of a misperception. Although, as we were just talking about, there are, of course, also power dynamics that still do hold and complicate things.
Thank you for this talk. It was really informative. I studied psychology in my undergrad, and one thing that was apparent was that people who are typically very attractive, like with facial symmetry, they have an easier time getting to yes, per se. So I'm wondering if you looked at this in the book in any way, especially for the asker, some of the studies, if you had a control for their level of attractiveness and how that came about in the results.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I get asked that just in terms of a lot of different physical features, right? And the thing that we found in our research is that a huge percentage of people, sometimes like regularly above 70%, sometimes even 80 or 90%, underestimate how likely it is that people will say yes to them. So we don't have a control for attractiveness, but the fact that it's so sort of consistent that people are making this mistake, it makes me think that most people will make this error, but it's an open question whether, for example, attractive people might make this error less if they're, but the question is, again, that gets to those three buckets, right? It's like actual influence. Maybe they do have more actual influence, but are they actually aware of it? Would they still have this bias? I'm not sure. Yeah. But the actual bias seems to be pretty consistent in our sample.
Our next question from online is from Teresa. What is your theory on why people are drawn to having influence?
I'm not sure. So I recently have been reading based on an Invisibilia episode that I heard and worked on. I've recently been reading things showing that people are actually kind of averse. Some people, at least, are averse to having power, at least. So I'm not entirely sure that people even are that comfortable with power and influence. I think it really depends on individual differences. But I think people, in fact, I think part of what draws people to these books that give them advice is that they don't know what to do. Like they haven't perfected having influence. I get more questions about like whether this is manipulation or influence than I do about how to have more influence. And often I think the influence people want to have, at least the people who talk to me, and that could be a select sample, is, pretty pro-social. I want to help people. I want to, get someone to stop doing the self-destructive thing. I want to convince people of an opinion I think is really important for the direction of our country or our school. So I feel like most of the influence I see comes from a pro-social place. And then there's the obvious places where, we feel like we want, to be paid fairly, and, we want to move up in our jobs. And there is this sort of like self-serving aspect as well. But I actually think the pro-social piece is just as important, if not more.
Thank you. I guess my question relates to the idea of that like invisibility shield. How does that perform along gender lines? At least I know like when I'm on the subway or the TCAT, kind of the more noticeable things do tend to come from like men who seem to be a little bit less aware of their surroundings. So I guess is that supported scientifically?
That's a good question. My memory of that paper is that there were not gender differences. But there is an interesting, so there's some sort of, in a very different domain, but I feel like it's related to your question. There's work by Juliana Pillemer, who's at NYU, on when people are told to be authentic, right? So if I'm going to send in like a job interview video and I'm told like, be authentic and we're going to review your video, men go all out. Like they see authentic as like, I'm going to do things that are borderline inappropriate. Women do bounded authenticity. So they're like still monitoring their behavior regularly. And I feel like that could be something you're observing, like this idea that like to some degree, women are just like a little bit more attuned to how people are looking at them at all times.
And we're getting low on time, so we're going to do one more from chat and then one from the room. So Dan asks, does age play any part in the influence?
Yeah, so the only really the only study I'm aware of on age is this one that I mentioned where younger people think older people are not going to be as interested in their advice than they actually wind up being. I get this question a lot about how, well, as you get older, are you like better at saying no? Are you more attuned to some of these things? And I don't have data on it, but I feel like I see so many anecdotes from my own parents and various people suggesting that this also could be a misperception. That like in the end, it's still really hard for many of us to say no and find the words. But it is an open question. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bohns. What about influence, your thoughts on influence, but from the positive side of the equation, especially from someone in a position of power? Someone in power who just completely underestimates how much influence they have, like you mentioned, but that they realize now that they have a power to garner this power and use it for positive influence. And I'm thinking someone, faculty like we are, or an employer. So from the other side of the positive influence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I definitely didn't mean to paint the picture that power necessarily corrupts, because, and in fact, the research suggests that it's not that simple, right? That in some cases, being in a position of power can actually highlight the responsibility that you have for other people's outcomes. And so the more you sort of think about power in terms of the responsibility that comes with it, the more you're attuned to people's feelings and how your decisions and actions might impact them. But I definitely think so. Some of the things I didn't get to talk about here are the fact that we underestimate how simple compliments, how good they make people feel, how expressing gratitude is so much more meaningful to people than we expect it to be. And again, all those things I would guess, although I don't know of any data on this, would be exacerbated by power. So if your boss gives you a compliment, that means a lot. And so I think just kind of being aware that our words can have that kind of power can, remind us to go ahead and use it in positive ways for sure.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you again, Professor Bohns, and thank you everyone for attending. And hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you so much.